Hello, and welcome to Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem. This is a regular program that we bring to you to give you some insight into our state leaders and state issues. The whole idea here is to have a relaxed environment where state leaders can talk about a variety of things with a minimal amount of interruption and also without the kind of noise that you hear sometimes in terms of instant events. I'd rather sit back and relax a little bit and find out about a more global view that a state leader may have and a global discussion of issues facing our state rather than just day-to-day affairs. I'm glad that you've joined us. Our guest today is our former state representative and now Secretary of State, Phil Keisling. Phil Keisling was appointed Secretary of State by Governor Barbara Roberts, and instead of me telling you about his background, I'm going to ask Phil to do so. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'm glad to have you with us. And I started off by hitting you with the Secretary of State appointment. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how that happened?
Well, it happened rather suddenly. In November, of course, Oregonians elected Barbara Roberts as governor, which set up the prospect that one of her first acts as governor would be to appoint somebody to fill out the 2 years of her term, the unexpired term. And it was the last thing on my mind after the November election. In fact, I wasn't even contacted till at least a month afterwards, but was notified that they had put me on a long list of possibilities. I thought that, well, it'd be nice, though I've only served one term in the legislature, it'd be a great honor at least to be on a long list to be even considered for it. And events moved rather quickly, and the day before Christmas, Governor Roberts announced that she had chosen me to serve out the unexpired term. There were a number of other just excellent people that she had to choose from, and I was very flattered and honored that she ended up choosing me. And needless to say, it was the last thing I expected. The job is one that I'm very excited about. It's an office that is one of the 3 constitutional offices named in the Oregon Constitution.
Well, you're first in line of succession to the governor if anything happened to her, aren't you?
Well, in most cases that's true. However, in 1972, Oregonians passed a ballot measure that, according to the legal experts, I'm not an attorney, but the legal experts say that the ballot measure seems to set up the situation where if it's an appointed Secretary of State, it would shift to the next, which would be the state treasurer. But certainly, in most cases, the Secretary of State is the second-ranking state official, and of course, as such, has a lot of responsibilities that part of the office. We've got, for example...
I'm going to interrupt you for a minute, though, because I'm curious about something.
Okay.
Did Governor Roberts call you and say, Phil, I want to appoint you Secretary of State, will you do it? And then follow up with you and gather information. This is a mysterious process.
It is a bit of a mysterious process, and it was actually, interesting enough, a job I never lobbied for. I never called up friends and say, gee, you ought to call up the governor and say, appoint Phil. What happened was I had come back from a field trip to Winnemucca, Nevada, looking at heap leach gold mining operations. I was on the Environment and Energy Committee, and it was part of my duties connected with that. And I returned to Portland and got a call from Carrie Barnett saying that I indeed was on this list. The list was getting shorter and I was still on it, and in fact the governor wanted to talk to me about it. So I said, okay, sure. The day I had the interview scheduled happened to be the day, I remember it keenly, it was the 21st of December, we got about 3 inches of snow in Portland, and I had a 9 o'clock appointment. I left at about 6:30 in the morning, and I still managed to be 45 minutes late. It took me over 3 hours to get to Salem. And Barbara had already gone to breakfast. She figured I wasn't going to be there. I ran into her in the hall, and she says, I can't even believe you came down today. The weather's so bad. I said, well, I'm here. The Capitol was nearly deserted, and we rescheduled, and we ended up having lunch together and talking about the job. And I think it wasn't until that day that it was keenly impressed on me that this was a very real possibility. I wasn't just somebody that she was talking to, going through the motions on. It was a real possibility.
Did she finally call you later on to say, Phil, I want you to take the job and talk to you about it?
Yes, she did. I, of course, had to do some real hard thinking about it. I didn't want her to call me and offer me the job and for whatever reason said, well, I wasn't going to say yes. I did have to do some thinking because it involves a major change in plans. I very much enjoyed the legislature. I look forward to the next session.
So you had to mull over all of this as you...
Family considerations. We were expecting a baby, which Benjamin was born in March. It's been quite a year for us. And had to talk a lot with Pam about it, because one of the other implications was that by taking this job, it had the ironic effect of preventing my wife from becoming director of a state agency. She had a very good chance to be the director of the Division of State Lands, which is the state agency that has jurisdiction over on the land board, forest land, grazing land, submerged and submersible lands.
Well, is this a conflict or an ethics kind of question?
Yeah, because in effect this Division of State Lands is the administrative arm of the State Land Board. Secretary of State, along with the governor and the treasurer, is on the State Land Board, and the State Land Board directly hires the director.
So you had that situation, and Barbara finally called you, and...
Barbara finally called and said, how would you like to be a constitutional officer? And I said, I'd love it. And she said, I want to keep it a surprise, though. You know, there's a lot of speculation about this. I do want to keep it a surprise. And so
How long
over the
did
weekend,
you have to keep it under your hat?
about 3 days. And I was, as a former journalist, it was interesting to follow some of the various media and how they played it. Several radio stations had me at least on the short list, but over the weekend the Oregonian published a list of people who were being considered, and I wasn't even on the list.
Well, so much for accuracy in media. We're going to stop for a moment so I can mention to our audience that you're with us on Capital Insight. If you ever want to write with any questions or concerns, write to H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon 97310. And I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix. My guest today is our Secretary of State, Phil Keisling. Let me turn back to this appointment process, because you've just been reelected to the legislature to your second term, and take you back a little bit in time. In terms of your political career, I mean, you were about to become a second-term legislator, but what brought you into politics in the first place?
Well, I have always been very interested in public affairs and politics. I grew up in Oregon, out in Washington County. After I graduated from college, I decided I wanted to go into journalism. I had a little bit of a detour. I ended up working for 3 months for Tom McCall's 1978 gubernatorial campaign, where sometimes referred to as the first and the unsuccessful Oregon comeback, because he tried to reclaim the governorship and lost in the primary. But I ended up in journalism, worked for Willamette Week for 3.5 years, a Portland newspaper, and covered the legislature, 79, 81, and several of the special sessions during those years when the budget problems were so severe. And then I went back to Washington, D.C. for a couple of years and worked for a magazine called the Washington Monthly. Both the Willamette Week and the Washington Monthly practiced a type of journalism that was not typical. Most journalism, of course, just reports the who, what, where, when.
Wouldn't you call it advocacy journalism?
Interpretive journalism.
Interpretive?
Yeah. It's journalism with a point of view. Journalism where you're encouraged to obviously report the facts and be accurate with all of that, but also to have a point of view, to say, well, what does this mean? What's behind all the information? How do we sort through it? And I had a chance to do that in both places. It was a tremendous opportunity to learn a lot about many different things. I covered everything from land use to energy policy when I was back in Washington. I covered education, healthcare, the Pentagon. But after a certain period of time, about 6.5 years, I was getting restless, and one reason was that it's one thing to sit in your office and in a typewriter and describe how you think the world ought to work and what ought to happen with this and that and these programs. But that's an easy thing to do. You don't have a lot of personal stake in it. It's you're commenting on things. But changing things, actually making a difference, requires you to get into a different kind of arena. You know, you can talk all you want about it, but it's people in legislative bodies, for example, that really have the power to do something about it. And so I returned home. I had some job offers some possibilities to do journalism back there. I mean, if I wanted to go for the work at the Washington Post or Newsweek or places like that, I think I could have. But decided to come home and found a job working for Vera Katz.
That's what I was going to jump in.
Speaker of the House.
Didn't she bring you into the legislative process, so to speak?
Exactly. In fact, I came back and I mulled over running it for an open seat. There were some possibilities, but I said, well, it's too early. I'm just back. And I ran into Vera, and she'd just been elected speaker, and says, why don't you come down and work with me and help me with the session. That was in 1985. And I did that, both 85 and the 87 sessions. It was an invaluable experience. Of course, you're still not making decisions, but as a staff person, you're in the middle of that, and you can have influence, because staff people do have influence. And I've always been very attracted to the Oregon's idea of a legislative process. I think we have something in this state that you don't find in many other states. You don't find it in states that have gone to professional legislatures like California, where I think the deliberative process is really broken down in many respects. You have people from all walks of life converge in Salem 6 months out of every 2 years, and while certainly the job demands are getting increasing all the time, and the notion of a true citizens legislature is getting a little bit more distant, you still have, I think, most people who are in the process very interested in making a difference, are here not just because they want to be known as legislators, but want to change things. And you look at what people like John Kitzhaber have done, the Senate President, with the health care plan, what Vera has done with education reform, which I was very interested in as a legislator. You know, Oregon still has that potential for national leadership. We're showing the way for a lot of other states. And
is part of that because we have people who are gutsy enough and have the innovation because of the fact that they're not tied to the pure political process?
Yeah, and quite honestly, knowing some of these people, Vera, for example, you know, Vera was interested in doing what she thought was the right thing, and if it meant that she wouldn't survive the next election, so be it. You're not here to worry about the next election. You're here to try to do the right thing. And I think that spirit is pretty strong. Now, obviously, we all have our criticisms of the legislature. When I was a legislator, I had my criticisms of it. We have moved too slowly on some things, and the role of money in this process is one that disturbs me, because it's gotten to the point where you need $100,000 to run in a hotly contested race for the Oregon House, which I just think is way too much money. But we still have that sense of possibility here. And that was something that, as I watched as a staff person and worked with Vera, kind of tempered, combined with my own native sense of optimism, I said, you know, if a chance came up to run in my own right, I'll take it. And indeed, that's what happened, with about as much warning as the Secretary of State appointment did. About 3 months before the May 1988 primary, a state senator unexpectedly announced that he was not going to run for re-election. The state representative in my district moved into the Senate race, created an open seat. I then had about 100 days to go out and knock on as many doors as I could. I was very much an underdog. There was someone in the race who, actually with the wife of the former state senator, had a lot of name familiarity. But I said, if I'm going to do it, now's the time to do it. And I went out and knocked on about 7,000 doors in 100 days. You know the drill, over and over again, telling people who you are and why you want to serve them in the legislature. And got elected in 1988 and served the 1989 session.
Now let's talk about that for a minute, because when you came into the into the 89 session as a newly elected legislator, you quickly developed a reputation as something of a whiz kid in the legislature. I can say that. And I mean that in a very favorable sense, someone who's intelligent and articulate. At the same time, my impression is that you certainly were able to hit the ground running because of prior service as a staff member and also as a reporter who'd seen this legislative process. Some of us, and I have to admit I'm one of them, even though the Capitol is right near to my home, didn't haunt the halls of the legislature very often until we arrived as legislators. So how did you feel about shifting seats, in effect, moving from one side of the committee podium to the other?
Well, it was a real transition. I did have a huge advantage, both because of having the chance to work for the Speaker of the House and then my experience as journalism. In fact, every session from 79 on, except for the 83 session when I was in Washington, I had been involved in. I'd covered it or been a staff person on. And that was a big advantage. Shifting, though, it tests your patience, for one thing. When you're sitting in the audience and writing about the process and you think certain things ought to happen, you have a sense of impatience when you're on the other side and you have to go through line by line with bills. It is a very deliberative process, and you have to do a lot of work, in the hallways, outside, building coalitions, building consensus. One of the things I spent the most time on as a legislator was I was on the Environment and Energy Committee, and there was a bill.
You were about to say E&E, but that's
jargon.
Jargon.
E&E.
You're right. Environment and Energy.
Environment and Energy Committee. You caught me at that. We had a proposal to get companies that use toxic chemicals to use less of them. And in fact, the original proposal set up this huge, very complex, and I don't think particularly workable regulatory scheme for doing that, advocated by Oregon State Public Interest Research Group, OSPRG, and they said that we want a bill, we think this is very important, and they were very right about that, and we may go with an initiative if the legislature doesn't respond. And I worked for about 2 months to the point of meetings once, twice a week, and squeezed in with all the other scheduling of the hearing with a working group trying to forge a consensus bill, a bill that addressed the goals that I think both industry and the environmental community was trying to address, but went about it in a way that was more workable, that gave people a chance to try a more voluntary information-based approach rather than a strict regulatory approach first. And that was a very important piece of legislation, and probably the thing I was proudest of as a legislator, because when we started out, it looked like both sides could not reach agreement. You'd have to fight it out in an initiative campaign that would be expensive and divisive and the like. But we were able to avoid that by just getting people to sit down and working through a lot of the details. And
now, isn't
as you know, as it's consensus building, and it's also knowing the details. That's one thing that impressed me over and over and over again, is the people who are able to do well in that process, to find points of agreement where others might give up, are the people who are able to spend the time, know a subject well enough that they can find those points of convergence. Because it's easy to get to no, harder to get to yes, but I think there's something in people that wants to be able to get there if they can, and you just have to find where the keys are.
Aren't the most successful politicians in the legislature the consensus builders? I think of Vera Katz, a person who is...
Or John Kitzhaber.
A person who has a point of view, but who is willing to sit down and be open to the perspectives of other people, and then try to find areas of agreement, and sometimes be willing to compromise. And yet the press, well, the people generally tend to criticize politicians who compromise as though somehow they've compromised on their principles.
Right. There are certain issues that people are just going to have a position on that's a matter of their basic values and philosophies. I mean, I can think of, a handful of those kinds of issues. I mean, are you for or against the death penalty, or you're pro-choice, pro-life? Where are you on issues like abortion? The vast majority of issues, however, do not have that kind of stake involved in them. Crime. I mean, I think all Oregonians, Republican, Democrat, Independent, are very concerned about issues of crime and how we protect our neighborhoods and public safety. There may be some disagreement about the best strategies that people think. But if you sit down together and you try to understand the other point of view, have some empathy for that, and identify what you're trying to accomplish, and then set up some mechanisms to maybe try a combination of strategies, do this but also do that, make sure you are able to, if you start a strategy, to evaluate whether it's really working or not in order to allow you to shift. I find a lot of debates are about someone says this will work and someone else will say no it won't, something else is going to work, and neither side really has information that's really good and solid that proves that their particular thing works, or they just want it to work. It's gut instinct. And in fact, government in general, I think, does an inadequate job of following up of saying, gee, here's what we decided would work best, here's what a group of people at a given particular time said, this is the best way to go. We do a poor job of following up to determine whether or not that really was the case or not.
Well, you impress me as an analytical person and someone who's willing to objectively analyze, and you'll have your own field of values, but within that you're willing to analyze the issues. Now, don't we have another crop of politicians, though, and the ones who are willing to have the colorful press conference and make the extreme statements and get the splashy coverage, but that doesn't build consensus, does it?
I don't think it does. It obviously also doesn't build name familiarity. I joke with people, I've been Secretary of State now all of 8 months, which isn't long. I've been keeping track of the various ways I've been called. I think we've got 8 different versions of Secretary. It's Keisling, Kesserling, Kersling. And my favorite was the people from the city of Bandon who invited me to their gala centennial celebration and addressed me as Dear Secretary Riesling. Perhaps the greatest indignity is in 2 of the 5 court suits, the 2 suits that were drawn up by one of the most prominent, well-respected law firms in the city of Portland, spelled my name wrong in the court suit.
So you need to work on that.
You need it. There is that trade-off. If you want to have your name out there all the time and be flashy and go for the extreme, yeah, I think you can maybe get better known a lot faster. But I don't think it does as much to solve problems. And
I'm going to interrupt you for a minute because we're about 2/3 of the way through, and I want to mention to our audience that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and I'd invite any questions or concerns at any time. You can write to me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. Our guest today is Secretary of State Phil Keisling. Yes, Phil Keisling. We'll make sure everyone
Riesling, but
get the name right. And unfortunately, I have gotten it right all along, but it sounds like some people haven't. And you were talking a little bit now about the role of the Secretary of State, name familiarity. You are running for retention as Secretary of State.
I haven't formally announced that, but I fully intend to seek election in my own right next year.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about what the job really entails, and you might mention redistricting as one of the projects that comes around every 10 years.
Yeah. The normal duties in years when you don't have redistricting are really far-ranging. The most well-known are elections. We police elections. If election complaints are filed with our office, people run for office, they file with us, handle initiatives. We put out the voters pamphlet for the primary and general elections. But that's actually the smallest division in our whole shop. We've only got 12 employees out of about 200 who work in elections. The single biggest division is the auditing division. Oregon is the only state in the country whose Secretary of State is constitutionally given the responsibilities to be the state auditors. And that means our job is to make sure that the public accounts are correct and true, that we're spending money according to the rules, accounting for it properly. And more, and one of my top priorities as Secretary of State is to take that auditing role and not just look at whether columns of numbers match and money being spent according to law, which is very important, but to also look at whether programs are being run effectively. Are we getting the job done? Are we accomplishing the goals we've set out for ourselves? That's called performance auditing. We do
as opposed to financial auditing.
As opposed to financial auditing, and it's a bit like being the watchdog of government. There's huge potential in this office, and I'm very interested in pursuing, because particularly with Measure 5, people very legitimately ask the question of, how do I know that we're getting the most out of the public dollars that we're spending? And it's a very good question. I've already seen as a manager now, I've gone from the legislative branch into the executive branch, and I make policy. As a legislator now, I have to run an agency. I've already seen areas where it's clear to me that we're doing things on the basis of, well, we've always done it that way, as opposed to, does it make sense? And so there's definitely truth to those who know and believe that we're not effectively spending our money as best we can.
So you're going to be sort of like the Oregon answer to the General Accounting Office?
Absolutely. That's a very good analogy. Unfortunately, we do not have the kind of resources and the setup to move that quickly in that direction, but we've been doing performance auditing. More and more, we did one this spring that just showed with some simple changes we could collect over $5.5 million more in child support payments from delinquent parents, which is very important because not only puts more money into single-parent families and gets money to kids, but it reduces our welfare costs because a lot of people go on to public assistance onto welfare because they are not getting the child support that they're entitled to get by law.
Let me ask you something. We've got about 4 minutes left, and I wanted to touch a little bit about on your background, but before I jump to that, as Secretary of State, it sounds to me like you're also willing to discuss what I'll call broader social issues. What do you see as your role in that?
I think it's, I wear two hats. I do have to manage the office, everything from elections, auditing, corporations division, duties on the State Land Board. But I also think as a statewide official, I've got a great opportunity, in fact, a responsibility to be involved in larger issues as well. I very much care about the future of this state. I'm 36 years old, and when I think of the opportunities that are being presented to people of the next generation, people graduated from high school today, the difficult life that they face, the uncertainty in Oregon as our economy changes, you see what's happening in our timber-dependent communities, as we struggle with ballot measure 5, as we deal with an international economy that's much more competitive even than it was when I graduated from high school. I think we've got some tremendous challenges ahead of us. And while a lot of people are turned off about politics, I think most Oregonians still understand that politics matter. They understand that it's the way by which we try to address these concerns and the way in which we try to ensure that our kids have at least the same, if not better, opportunities than what we had.
Isn't it fair to say that, well, politics are going to be there. We better do what we can to make them be good politics as opposed to bad politics?
Exactly right.
Well, Phil, we've got 2 minutes left, and I really want to get out some information about you as a person.
Okay. I'm sorry.
You're a native-born Oregonian?
Native-born Oregonian.
Where?
Born in Portland, and then grew up in Beaverton, Washington County area. Went to
Where did you
Sunset High
graduate
School.
from? Sunset High School?
Sunset High School, and then went to Yale College and got my BA.
Now, you see, this is a well-known secret. I mean, it's probably in the voters' pamphlet.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
probably in lots of places. I say well-known secret to me in the sense that I wasn't aware that you were a Yalie, if I dare use that term. What year did you graduate?
1977.
Now, at Yale, do they say you took your degree as opposed to graduate?
I think they just say, at least I say graduate.
Sometimes universities have pompous ways. At Virginia, where I went, you took your degree, you didn't graduate. Or you received your degree. Well, after Yale, what did you do?
Well, after Yale, I actually went to Casper, Wyoming, and built houses for about 6 months, and learned a trade that if ever I got out of politics and needed to do something else, I could always fall back on that.
All right, now if I
and that actually it was a lot of fun.
I'm going to give you 30 seconds to tell me whatever else you want to tell me about Phil Keisling. Tell our audience about Phil Keisling, besides the fact that you want them to vote for you next year.
Well, I guess the thing that is most important to me is that there are a lot of things that I could have done with my life rather than going to politics. Some people think I was crazy to do it. But I guess maybe I'm a bit of an optimist, but I really do think that in this state, we have the opportunity, if we get really good people in politics, that we can be a leader both for our citizens here and next generation and also the rest of the country. And I'm very committed to that. People are not always going to agree with Phil Keisling on major issues or how he runs the office, but I hope to establish a record of caring, of integrity, and trying to do the right thing even if it's not always the popular thing.
All right, well, good for you. On that upbeat note, I'd like to thank you again for joining us today and mention to our audience that you've been joining us for Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix. My guest today was our Secretary of State, Phil Keisling, and I'd like to thank you again for joining us on Capital Insight. Until next time, take care.